So we are in Madrid for the conference of the DAMIN program about transfer of metal precious and precious metal and the history of coinage and currency and trade. I'm very pleased to be with my old friend Flynn, who is one of the most outstanding scholars about this question. So you spend your life working on this question of metal and transfer and silver. So how can you present shortly your works?
Well, I began working on silver and Spanish-American silver back in 1974, 39 years ago. As a graduate student, I knew very little, almost nothing. And I wrote a PhD dissertation on the Spanish price revolution that was finished in the end of 1977. And I became very interested in the silver question. But the thing that really became interesting for me was after the dissertation was finished, because my own dissertation was Eurocentric. It was Europe, everything was the price revolution, and Asia would be mentioned occasionally in a footnote or a footnote of a footnote. And so in the 1980s, I began looking more closely, secondary literature about things going on in Asia. And it turns out that the silver wasn't going to abstract Asia, but rather the silver was going mostly to China. And in fact, the second biggest silver producer in the world at that time, late 16th, early 17th century, was Japan, producing maybe half as much silver as all of Spanish America. And that silver also, of course, was going to China. So it kind of thrust me into a global topic without even intending to do so.
So in fact, it concerned the complete world, the whole world.
Exactly, the complete world.
Have you got some idea about the amount of ton of silver that were extracted and traded during this period?
Well, I don't know myself. I just read secondary sources, but I think the best website is that of Richard Gardner, and people talked about Richard Gardner today. And I think he said that the rough estimate over the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries in Spanish America was something in the order of 150,000 tons. But remembering that silver was very valuable at the time, not like today.
Yeah.
And so the quantities were astonishing. I mean, enormous.
So, in fact, the import in China was as important as the import in Europe.
Yeah, the silver, not so much as I thought back in the 70s, went to Europe, but it went through Europe mostly.
Yeah.
And ends up in China, including over the Pacific Ocean, which is why Filipinos have Spanish surname and the only Christian country in Asia, because of the silver going one direction and the silks coming the opposite direction from China.
So you insisted in your works on the importance of Filipina. How important was this trade?
Well, the Philippines, the amount of silver going over the Atlantic was certainly greater than the amount going over the Pacific. Roughly speaking, maybe 3/4 over the Atlantic and 1/4 over the Pacific. But the interesting thing, or one of the interesting things about the Pacific trade, is that was Spain's only direct connection into Asia, because the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the others had beat them to the Cape route and the other routes. And so Spain controlled as much as anybody could the Atlantic trade, but once it hit Europe, they lost control completely. But over the Pacific, they at least had access.
This metal stayed in China, or?
Well, it's an interesting question. You know, if people ask that question a lot. How is it possible, the so-called silver sink, the endless silver sink? But lately I've been using what I call a hydraulic metaphor. And it indicates the inventory thinking, inventory demand. So imagine a gigantic pool, a pond or a swimming pool. Well, we know that silver, like any other commodity of this sort, I mean, it wears out very slowly, but maybe 1 or 2% per year.
Yeah.
But if the volume of silver in China is, let's say for the sake of argument, 500 million pesos, at 1% you need to import 5 million pesos per year or 10 million pesos per year in the case of 2% wear and tear, just to keep the stock the same. So one of the reasons why silver continues to come into China, there are other arguments too, but one of the reasons that it continues to come in for such a long period of time is this inventory stock demand, inventory supply thinking.
So more they imported silver, more they needed to maintain the level of silverization.
That's right. And then when population grew, particularly in the 18th century, population grew very dramatically because of American plants that were transported and didn't exist previously in China. So the swimming pool got much bigger. And so there are two reasons for the silver to come in. One is the demand is much bigger, and the other one is the wear and tear, the decay rate, we call it.
So it's endless.
It's not endless, but it's seemingly endless. Goes on for centuries.
So you are continue working. So what are your future works, actually?
Well, what I've been doing in recent years, there's a formal model, mathematical, back in the 1980s that I co-developed. And it's been sitting in the background, and I've been doing this historical work for 25 years, more than that actually. And now I'm bringing the model out in the front. And tomorrow, actually, the presentation that I'll do is intended to be really more theoretical. It uses historical information, but the idea is to try to explain the theory in such a way that non-economists hopefully can use this kind of reasoning.
Yeah, that's...
which is
make it
difficult to do.
It's, for historians, so it's difficult to move.
But I'm confident that I can make partial progress anyway.
So you have listened a lot of paper this morning and this afternoon. What is your impression about this program?
I think the program is excellent. The program is excellent. I sometimes have to bite my lip a bit because I want to jump in when people are not using my model, but how could they possibly be using it when I'm still in the process of trying to present it. But it'll be fun to talk to these people tomorrow after my own presentation as well. But it's a wonderful group of scholars, and one thing that impresses me very much is people coming from even different disciplines. It's quite interdisciplinary, which I think is much more so than you would find in trade or global trade in other products, which is quite interesting.
Thank you very much. In any case, it was our pleasure to listen to your papers and to read your works and to see you in Madrid in this conference. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much for all of your tremendous organizational efforts which make this possible for all of us.
Thanks.
Thank you.